Turkey terror suspects traced to former Soviet states. This as Congress questions our Homeland Security. Threat to religious liberty. How inaction on a Washington state pharmacy case contradicts the Supreme Court's Hobby Lobby ruling. Shedding new light on human trafficking. Tonight, one woman's personal story. And special Jubilee audience. The Pope expands his message of mercy. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, June 30th, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. The Pentagon will now allow transgender individuals to serve openly in the U.S. military. Defense Secretary Ash Carter announced the change this afternoon.
Effective immediately, transgender Americans may serve openly, and they can no longer be discharged or otherwise separated from the military just for being transgender. Additionally, I have directed that the gender identity of an otherwise qualified individual will not bar them from military service or from any accession program.
Carter says under this new policy, transgender troops would receive any medically necessary care, including sex reassignment surgery. Senior military leaders expressed concerns that the Defense Department is moving too quickly, not allowing time to work through these changes. Some analysts call this the crown jewel in President Obama's so-called LGBT rights legacy. EWTN's Dr. Matthew Bunson, a theologian and historian, puts it into Catholic context.
As Pope Benedict XVI stressed, as Pope Francis has stressed, to treat individuals who are homosexual, who are transgender, with respect and with an eye toward their innate dignity. At the same time, we also have to be mindful, as the Catechism teaches us, that man and women have been created, willed by God, and in their respective beings as man and woman.
Meanwhile, a Virginia school board fights a court mandate allowing a transgender student to use the boys' bathroom. The school board wants a federal judge to put the order on hold while it asks the Supreme Court to intervene. The board claims an outcry from parents and students could cause severe disruption to the school when classes resume this fall. And other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Turkey reveals new information about the 3 suicide bombers who attacked the Ataturk airport in Istanbul. It says they were from Russia, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Russian President Vladimir Putin says between 5,000 and 7,000 people from the former Soviet Union have joined ISIS. And police in Turkey have been conducting raids looking for anyone that may be connected to Tuesday's bombing. So far, they've detained 13 people. The terror attack is now blamed for 44 deaths. The Homeland Security Secretary talks about the terrorist attack and protecting the U.S. from terrorism. Jason Calvi reports from Capitol Hill tonight. Jason?
Brian, it got pretty testy inside today. Senator Cruz pushing the secretary on the use of the word radical Islam. It was just one of the many fireworks inside the Senate Judiciary hearing today.
I have an ongoing dialogue with the Turkish government, including later this afternoon.
U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson says the Istanbul airport attack has all the hallmarks of ISIS.
The American public should expect to see this July 4th weekend an enhanced security presence at airports, train stations, and other transit centers across the country.
Republicans have had concerns terrorists could sneak into the United States through the refugee process. The Obama administration is settling 10,000 Syrians this year.
And approximately 5,000 have been approved for resettlement and just have not been physically resettled yet in the United States. And another 5,000 or 6,000 have been conditionally approved, subject to those security checks.
And the man who oversees immigration and borders. Interrupted today by immigration activists.
Jay Johnson, you have blood on your hands. Jay Johnson, you have blood on your hands. Stop stating.
But that wasn't the only heat for Secretary Johnson.
Scrubbing your law enforcement materials of any acknowledgement of radical Islamic terrorism when you see the red flags of radical Islamic terrorism. you do not follow up on them effectively, and we have terrorist attack after terrorist attack after terrorist attack.
I think the labels, frankly, are less important, except where we need to build bridges to American Muslim communities and not vilify them so that they will help us help them.
And Secretary Johnson pushing back even more on Cruz, saying virtually every day he learns of police and intelligence connecting the dots on possible terrorist plots. Brian?
Jason Calvi at the Capitol. Thank you, Jason. Former CIA officer Clare Lopez is now at the Center for Security Policy. Clare, is there a message behind this latest attack? And if so, who is it aimed at?
Well, the attack at the main airport in Istanbul, Turkey, clearly is aimed at Turkey, which after a period of time when it actually had been allowing its territory to be used as a transit point for jihadis en route to Middle East battlefields and training camps for them too, has now taken steps to close its border to those jihadis passing through. And so it may be that this is a response to some of those policies.
We've heard that no one has claimed responsibility, but also other previous attacks in Turkey, ISIS has been quiet about as well. Is that the case here, do you think?
So far, yes, it has been. The hallmarks, as they say, of the attack seem to point to the Islamic State for sure. But they have not claimed officially any responsibility yet, and they may not ever do so.
But today we find out that the attackers are from former Soviet Union countries, Russia and others. Is there anything significant to that? It seems odd.
Well, it's only that from these places, we note Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, some of the former Soviet republics back in the USSR days, a lot of Muslim recruits have gone to join the jihad with the Islamic State from these places, unfortunately.
We're getting ready to celebrate America's independence this weekend. Should we be concerned that the threat of terrorism will really rob us of some of the freedoms that we know as Americans?
Let's hope not. I would say, first of all, to keep clear in our minds, we're not fighting terrorism. We are fighting to live free of Sharia, of Islamic law. And we need to be extra alert, certainly in places where we might gather in large groups for holiday celebrations and the like. But we shouldn't be thinking that we have to give up our freedoms. We are defending the Constitution. We shouldn't have to be considering how we're going to lose it, but rather to defend it while being alert and with situational awareness around us.
That is pretty much the philosophy of terrorism, is to instill fear. So if we don't fall for that, we're actually winning.
Yes.
Clare Lopez, we appreciate your insight, your expert advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, a false alarm today at Joint Base Andrews. Someone reported an active shooter, not realizing that what appeared to be gunmen were security forces doing a routine inspection. That confusion was heightened by a planned drill at the base near Washington that had not yet begun. The base says there was no shooter, no threat. Joint Base Andrews, about 20 miles outside of Washington in Maryland, is home to the President's Air Force One. The Taliban claims responsibility for twin suicide attacks on a convoy of buses carrying police cadets. The Interior Ministry says 30 police recruits were killed along with several civilians. Dozens of people were wounded in this morning's attack west of Kabul, the Afghan capital. The first suicide attacker struck 2 buses carrying trainee police officers. Then a second attacker targeted those who rushed to the scene to help the wounded. Iraq's defense minister releases footage showing airstrikes on what's described as a convoy of Islamic State fighters. They were reportedly fleeing Fallujah after its recapture by the Iraqi military. Scores of militants are thought to have been killed in the airstrikes, many vehicles destroyed. An Iraqi commander says the operation was carried out exclusively by the Iraqi military. No other force was involved. A Navy investigation blames weak leadership and poor judgment for Iran's embarrassing capture of 10 U.S. soldiers in January. The Navy says the captains and crews failed to get permission to change their route in the Persian Gulf. They also neglected to report an engine failure that led to their capture. The Navy does accuse Iran of violating international law.
These 2 boats and their crew members had every right to be where they were on that day. And the investigation concluded that Iran violated international law by impeding the boat's innocent passage transit, and they violated sovereign immunity by boarding, searching, and seizing the boats, and by photographing and videotaping the crew.
The U.S. Navy says 6 officers and 3 enlisted sailors have been disciplined or now face disciplinary action. A federal judge blocks an Indiana law which would have banned abortions based on genetic abnormalities such as Down syndrome. The law was set to take effect tomorrow, but Planned Parenthood and the ACLU filed a suit to stop it. They're also challenging a provision requiring aborted babies to be buried or cremated. The Congressional Prayer Caucus accuses the Supreme Court of doing great damage to religious freedom in America. The High Court refused this week to hear the case of pharmacists in Washington state. They object to dispensing abortion-inducing drugs. The state ordered a family-owned pharmacy to sell so-called Plan B contraception. Oklahoma Senator James Lankford co-chairs the Congressional Prayer Caucus, joining us now from the U.S. Capitol. Senator, you and other senators urged the Supreme Court to take up the Washington pharmacy case. I imagine you're disappointed that they won't hear it.
I'm extremely disappointed. The Stormins case is one of those anchor cases, and what Justice Alito said, this is an ominous sign for religious liberty. It's a pretty basic thing to say that people should be able to live their rights of conscience, whether it's as an individual at home, whether at work, or whether at church. And what the Supreme Court, by refusing to take it up, basically allowed the Washington state law that specifically targeted people of faith to say that the state's emphasis is more important than your personal faith. And I adamantly disagree with that.
Do you think it's possible to protect the religious liberty rights of the pharmacists as well as the customers?
It is, actually, and there was an easy way to be able to do it. In this particular case, as you know well, in 2007, Washington State basically said that every pharmacy has to carry whatever they tell them they have to be able to carry and what could be prescribed back to them, with a few exceptions, one of them, for instance, being cost. If they couldn't make enough money on it, they didn't have to carry it, but they didn't give them an exemption based on faith, except for an individual pharmacist. So if you come walking into a pharmacy like the Stormins and they said they have a religious belief that they shouldn't carry the morning after pill, which is an abortifacient, but there are multiple other pharmacies in the area, they would allow them to refer. They said, we don't carry that, but here are other pharmacies within a 2-mile radius, which is not difficult for people. Within 2 miles, here are other pharmacies that do carry the morning after pill. We just don't carry it based on faith reasons.
Senator, are we as Americans who want to live our faith in the public square facing discrimination, and what can you do about that?
This is one of the difficult issues of our day, is that for whatever reason, the nation's becoming afraid of faith and of people of faith. They would say you can have faith, but you need to live your faith outside of the public square. You can practice faith at home, you can practice faith in your church, but don't take it to school, don't take it to work, don't take it out in the public area, don't speak about faith. That is completely contrary to who we are as Americans. We do not have freedom of worship in America. We have the free exercise of religion. That means you can both have a faith and live your faith in a public setting. We need to be able to step up and to say people of faith cannot be prohibited from living their faith. This particular Washington state law said an individual pharmacist could say, hey, I have conscience, I don't sell Plan B, but the pharmacy owner and the business itself didn't have rights of conscience. Well, that's absurd. You go back to the Hobby Lobby case just 2 years ago, where in Hobby Lobby case, they allowed the business owners to be able to live out their faith, and that was protected. But for whatever reason right now, the court stepped back and said, well, we're not going to speak to this issue at this point. We're going to leave it alone now in this new case. So it's completely conflicting with a case just from 2 years ago. That now in Washington state, you can't live your faith as a business owner, but in other cases, you can.
Oklahoma Senator James Lankford, thanks for joining us tonight.
We're glad to be able to join you.
Coming up, a controversial leader takes office, how Catholics view the new Filipino president, and societal challenges to marriage. The Archbishop for the Military Services expresses concerns. Thanks for joining us this Thursday evening, June 30th. I'm Brian Patrick. Stunning, outrageous. That's how Secretary of State John Kerry describes the sheer amount of human trafficking worldwide. Wyatt Goolsby joins us, and you talk with a woman who's using her past experience to help others.
Yes, Brian, she wants to give hope to victims of human trafficking, something Secretary Kerry calls modern-day slavery, one that claims 20 million victims worldwide.
They have names. They have or had families in many cases. And they are enforced to endure a hell, a living hell.
Secretary Kerry speaking candidly about the global problem of human trafficking. Today, the State Department released its findings, saying Myanmar, Sudan, and Haiti are currently among the worst offenders. The State Department removed Thailand from the list of worst offenders, but Kerry says forced labor remains widespread in the nation's lucrative seafood industry.
When criminals are able to turn a profit in an illegal fishing market, they'll go after as many fish as possible. So they also not only destroy lives of human beings, but they destroy an ecosystem. And the more labor they have on board, the larger their catches will be.
Kerry says the problem is not just overseas. Here in the U.S., many are lured by the false promises of money and a better life. Human rights advocate Barbara Amaya agrees, saying even today, trafficking happens in every state.
It's about vulnerable people having their very lowest time in their life, their vulnerable state being preyed upon for financial gain.
Amaya was a victim of sex trafficking for nearly a decade, starting at the age of 12. She was taken from Virginia to New York, where she was raped, abused, and sold, often in broad daylight. Now she speaks as an activist for other victims.
I had always thought that it was all my fault, even the earlier abuse that I experienced. And I, since, have taken my life back. And for me personally, it's very important. This work is my life. It's not just work. It's my purpose in my life.
Barbara Amaya says it's that idea of taking back her life she wants to relay to victims here in the U.S. and around the world. Every year, the State Department puts out the Trafficking in Persons report to bring public attention to the problem. And Brian, it's what Kerry calls a $150 billion industry.
That is shocking. Thank you, Wyatt. And maverick politician Rodrigo Duterte is sworn in today as the new president of the Philippines.
Do justice to every man. Do justice to every man. And consecrate myself to the service of the nation. To the service of the nation. So help me God. So help me God.
The 71-year-old former prosecutor describes himself as the country's first leftist president. He declares his foreign policy will not depend on the United States, a longtime ally. Duterte openly pushes sterilization and contraception. He wants to limit Filipino families to 3 children. From his aggressive birth control push to insulting Filipino bishops and even the Pope, President Duterte has a history of opposing the Catholic Church. EWTN host Father Leo Patalinghug was raised in the Philippines. He says Catholics there are rightfully concerned.
I think everyone's going to be concerned when they have a new president, especially one who seemingly goes very much against some very basic Catholic Church teaching, especially when it comes to the moral sanctity of human life and the great gift of human sexuality.
Father Leo encourages Filipino Catholics to make sure this separation of church and state doesn't lead to divorce. He says there needs to be conversation between the two because that leads to conversion. Well, he led the Brexit movement, but Boris Johnson will not leave the UK as its next prime minister. The vocal campaigner for British withdrawal from the European Union says he is no longer a contender. That leaves Justice Secretary Michael Gove and Home Secretary Theresa May as frontrunners to succeed Prime Minister David Cameron. Cameron immediately announced his resignation after voters decided Britain should withdraw from the EU. Financially strapped Puerto Rico gets some help from Congress, but no bailout and no direct financial aid. President Obama just signed into law a bill passed this week by the House and Senate. It creates a control board to oversee the U.S. territory's finances. The board will also supervise some restructuring of Puerto Rico's $70 billion debt. Since the Supreme Court's legal redefinition of marriage 1 year ago, the cultural push to redefine gender keeps building. It's an issue at the center of this past weekend's March for Marriage here in Washington, D.C. Archbishop Timothy Broglio heads the Archdiocese for the Military Services, and he serves on the USCCB subcommittee on the defense of marriage. Your Excellency, you were part of the March for Marriage this past weekend here in Washington. What was your message to that group?
My message was really twofold. One, the importance of defending marriage between a man and a woman, which of course respects the teaching of the Catholic Church. And secondly, to urge all of us, and I began with a prayer, that we continue this dialogue in a respectful and non-polemical fashion. And I also began with a prayer for the victims of those who were killed during the incident in Orlando recently.
Now that same-sex couples can legally marry in America and the gender lines are so blurred, How has the family suffered, and how in turn does the church suffer, since the church sees the family as the domestic church?
The church does see the family as a domestic church, and obviously it suffers because that image is blurred, and there's a tendency on the part of society to force everyone, including the church, to accept anyone's definition of marriage. And of course, we see marriage as also an image of the Trinity, that the love of husband and wife generates life. And that's very difficult to present if the family is not, as we would define, a family with a father and a mother and children.
It's so confusing because we have clear church teaching. How do we stay with church teaching while you are offering pastoral care to transgender individuals, people with same-sex attraction?
Well, I think there's always a dimension of drawing near to people in a pastoral fashion, not condemning them. And in addition, the church always makes a very clear distinction between the condition or the orientation and acting according to that orientation, and that's a very important distinction. So fundamentally, the church has tried to reach out to these people as she reaches out to all people in a fashion of inviting them to participate in the life of the church, but teaching very clearly what the Word of God teaches.
And we are all children of God. Archbishop Timothy Broglio, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here with you.
Up next, the Pope's message of mercy in action at a special Jubilee audience. And brace yourself for possibly record-setting holiday travel. June, the month dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, ends today. St. Margaret Mary Alacoque spread the devotion to the Sacred Heart after receiving a special revelation. Thanks for joining us this Thursday evening, June 30th. I'm Brian Patrick. Americans begin hitting the highway today as we prepare to celebrate our nation's independence. AAA projects nearly 43 million of us will travel this holiday weekend. That would set a new record. The holiday travel period runs from today through Monday, the 4th of July. AAA says 36 million people will drive to their destinations, 3.3 million plan to fly. Pope Francis closes the month of June with a special public audience. Alan Holdren, our Rome Bureau Chief for EWTN's Catholic News Agency, is with us tonight. Today's special Jubilee audience was the Pope's second this month. Alan, isn't this his last for a while?
Yes, he's actually going to be taking off the month of July from all general audiences, the special Jubilee audiences and the normal Wednesday general audiences included. He's got a very light schedule for the summer season. He's going to be at the end of July, of course, there at World Youth Day in Krakow for 5 really strong days, hard days of work.
So the Pope continued teaching on his theme of mercy. Where did he go with it today?
Well, today he spoke about not just God's mercy in sort of general terms, but concrete acts of mercy, or the works of mercy. He quoted St. James saying that mercy without works is dead. He said we really need to roll up our sleeves and go out and not fidget in the face of poverty, of need, but actually go out and act. And he invited everyone to do so through these concrete works of mercy, saying that Jesus will judge us on these works that we do here when we die.
And recently back from Armenia, Francis has other trips planned. Did he talk about his travels today?
Yeah, he spoke about going to Georgia and Azerbaijan. These are two other nations in what they call the Caucasus. They're on the eastern side of Europe. He said that he's going to affirm the people there in their faith and also to support the mutual respect among nations and the process of peace and reconciliation that is still taking place in these lands that have really gone through great trials in the last 100 years, he said.
All right, the Catholic News Agency's Alan Holdren. Alan, thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
And until tomorrow, for the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. We say goodnight with pictures from today's special Jubilee audience with Pope Francis, his last public audience until August. Good night. God bless you.